A Chinese delegation led by Premier Li Qiang is in Berlin for talks aimed at resetting relations between the two trading giants. German Economy Minister Robert Habeck has met with Zheng Shanji, the head of China's top economic regulator, to kick off the day of discussions. Climate change and economic issues top the agenda, but Germany is expected to also raise more contentious issues such as China's closeness to Russia and the country's alleged human rights abuses. The visit to Berlin is Premier Li Qiang's first foreign trip since taking office. The meeting is a balancing act for the German government, which has described China as both a partner and a systemic rival. So, what are Chancellor Olaf Scholz's priorities going into these consultations? I put that question to DW's chief international editor, Richard Walker.
Yeah, well, I think, Terry, he wants to really kind of juggle these seeming opposites in a way that doesn't seem too contradictory. And I think essentially what he would like to do is do two things at the same time. On the one hand, demonstrate that Germany and China can work together on issues of mutual importance. And the German side have been saying this year they wanted to really focus the consultations on the issue of climate change, on ways that Germany and China can cooperate towards fighting climate change. That obviously self-evidently an important thing for both sides and also an important thing for the world. So wanting to show that despite this sense of systemic rivalry between the two sides, that there is something that diplomacy can meaningfully achieve. So that on the one side, but at the same time, Scholz and the government here also want to signal that it's not completely sort of back to the business as usual, the decade and a half in which Germany and China became incredibly close under Angela Merkel, Scholz's predecessor as German Chancellor. So they also want to signal that it's not just completely back to the old days where Germany's relationship with China was all about making money. And I think some of the signals we're seeing there are the fact that there's no large mutual statement expected after these talks, which had been a feature of talks in the past. So that's the line that Scholz is trying to walk here.
There have been calls, Richard, for Germany to decrease its reliance on China. De-risking is the buzzword at the moment. How far is Germany prepared to go in that direction?
That's right. De-risking, also diversification. These are the kind of buzzwords that are out there at the moment. Certainly everyone can agree that diversifying supply chains is a good thing. Risk sounds bad, right? So we want to reduce risk. The question is, what is a risk and what is not a risk? And there you can have significant room for debate. So while the German government and other Western governments and Japan, for instance, so these kind of democratic allies around the world have come together behind this idea of de-risking, I think what we're going to see in the months ahead and the years ahead, in fact, is different interpretations of what that really means coming out in the wash. And our understanding of Olaf Scholz in particular, he has a pretty narrow view of de-risking, really focusing on wanting to avoid German businesses and Germany as a whole being too dependent on Chinese sources of key raw materials that are important for German industry.
It's worth noting, of course, that Berlin is the first stop on the Chinese premier's first foreign trip since taking office, not Washington, not Brussels. What's China hoping to get out of these discussions, Richard?
I think really China's biggest priority in its relations with Germany, but also Europe more broadly, is to try to keep Germany and Europe as far apart from the United States as possible. China has essentially decided that its relationship with the United States is fundamentally broken. I think that's probably not going to change in a fundamental sense. After the positive signals we saw from Tony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, in Beijing over the last couple of days. So China wants Germany and Europe to be as far apart from the U.S. as possible, to try at least to avoid too strong a united bloc in coordinating relations against it. Obviously, the German side, though, is aware that this is what the Chinese want. So they're trying to avoid being sucked into what they might see as kind of Chinese diplomatic games.
Richard, thank you very much. Our chief international editor, Richard Walker, there.
New Chinese Premier Li Qiang urged more economic ties between his country and Germany at the start of his visit to Europe, his first trip overseas in his new position. Qiang met with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz in Berlin, where he said the two nations had an obligation to work together on a continued economic recovery following the pandemic. Qiang's visit comes as major Western economies, including Germany, have actually sought to de-risk from China or lower their trade ties due to geopolitical concerns. China is Germany's largest trade partner outside of the EU. So smaller companies are reconsidering their ties with China, but what about larger ones? I asked Holger Görg from the Kiel Institute of the World Economy whether big German companies weren't actually increasing their dependence on China.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think it's probably fair to say that the larger the company, the more difficult it is to make a move. You have companies like the automobile producers that are quite important in China that have established production facilities. They employ thousands of people. And of course, for them, it is very difficult to move somewhere. On the one hand, because China is an important market for them, one of the most important and growing markets for them. So you don't want to leave a market that's doing well. On the other hand, as I said, they have production facilities there. They have built buildings and they're employing lots of people. So it's very, very difficult for them to make a move.
How concerned are these companies right now, given tensions, for example, with Taiwan? We heard in that piece that there's a smaller company saying if there's sanctions, we do a lot of business with America. That would be a problem. What about if you're Volkswagen? How problematic is that potentially?
Well, potentially it could be very problematic. Of course, if Volkswagen, I think, sells about a quarter of their cars in China, so that's a huge market, very, very important. And of course, they also export from China, so they build a certain type of car there and export it. Having said that, it seems to be that companies themselves, the large companies themselves, don't necessarily see it as a very risky market at the moment. We had a couple of weeks ago in Germany statements by CEOs of large companies saying that they are committed to the Chinese market. BASF, the chemical multinational, has, of course, also announced large investments in China to build new facilities. So even though the risk is obviously there, if something does go wrong, it seems that certainly the CEOs of the large companies don't really value that risk, or don't really estimate that risk as being very high at the moment.
What about this current German government, a coalition government? Is it making it clear enough to those businesses what the potential risk is?
That's a good question. I think these companies are very well aware of the risk. I'm not even sure they necessarily need the government to tell them what's going on. I think they're very clued in. They have very, very good management. So I think they're able to make these decisions. I think the government itself, it's not really so clear what exactly their outlook, their strategy towards China is. Is it a competitor? Is it a cooperation partner? Is it somewhere in between? Is it extreme? I think even in the three parties in the government, it's not really clear where they are, and therefore, certainly the government at the moment doesn't really provide a very good route as to where we should go and what people should think about China.
All right, that's Holger Görg at the Kiel Institute for World Economy. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Well, Reinhard Bütikofer is a member of the European Parliament for the Greens. I asked him whether the German Chancellor has been too soft on China.
This is clearly the outcome of these consultations. The Chinese Prime Minister can be very satisfied that he found a chancellor that was at best soft peddling all the contentious issues. So human rights, for instance, were indeed mentioned, but Xinjiang was not, Hong Kong was not. And the chancellor said that there should be better respect for human rights in China. That's a ridiculous phrase, if you pardon me, because there's absolutely no respect. Why does he say such a sentence? And also, I would say, when the Chancellor says that global challenges can only be dealt with together between Germany and China, well, I would add some of the global challenges are originating from the communist regime in Beijing, and I would rather not have those problems, and to imply that we can not solve these problems without the help of China is just putting the world topside down.
Right. So just explain to us, I think you touched on it there right at the end, why you think the Chancellor is soft peddling on China.
Well, the Chancellor obviously feels obliged to pay tribute to the interests of some German and European enterprises that have heavily invested in China. Over the last 2 years only, there has been an additional investment of some 20 billion, or a little more than that even, so that today Germany's industry altogether is invested with more than 110 billion in China. Obviously, he wants to make sure that these interests would not be impacted. However, I feel that to not call a spade is not helpful in that regard. China has been passing law after law that infringes upon safe investment. For instance, the most recent anti-espionage law basically amounts to illegalizing any serious corporate due diligence. I think the Chancellor would have been gaining more respect from the Chinese if he had indeed spoken realities instead of just schmoozing his guest.
One of the reasons, I guess, he couldn't speak with a greater voice is because of the splits within the German government, with your Green Party pushing for more restrictions on economic relations than the Chancellor is willing to agree. So that disunity within the German government effectively gives the Chancellor a free hand, doesn't it?
Well, I would describe the situation a bit differently. I would say that we are on the European line. The positions that we're representing in the government is very much the European position. Listen to what President von der Leyen had to say and compare that to what the Chancellor said. That's two different worlds. I feel that the Chancellor lost an opportunity to really Europeanize Germany's government consultations, and he tried to foster bilateral relations at the expense of the common European line. I regret that.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for put your position very clearly. Member of the European Parliament, Reinhard Bütikofer. Thank you.